Big Apple Blitz with Anthony Rivardo and Matt O'Leary.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Big Apple Blitz, coming to you on the morning of the legal tampering period. What is going on? I am Matt O'Leary, joined as always by my co-host Anthony Rivardo. Anthony, how are you today, my friend?
I'm good, man. I'm excited. I mean, today's the day that we've been waiting for. We've been talking quite a lot about all the different free agent possibilities, who the Giants and Jets could or should extend or maybe sign as a free agent. Today's the day. We're going to get a lot of these answers to these questions. And now that the trade market is starting to heat up as well, we might see some blockbuster trades come to fruition as well.
Absolutely. So figure on this one, we start by talking about guys that have been retained by both Jets and Giants, if they should keep some of their bigger name free agents that are hitting the market, as you see Bryce Huff and Xavier Mckin on the screen. But I think we got to start with the latest news happening just a few minutes before we logged on here to do the show. Jets extend kicker Greg Zuerlein to a 2-year deal, $8.4 million. The $4.2 million AAV, I believe, is 11th for kickers. So I think this is a good deal for both sides. And I know, like, a little boring, like a special teamer or kicker, but he was really good for the Jets last year. He hit 92% of his kicks, was 5 of 6 from 50 plus. He's been with the Jets the last 2 years. They've really struggled at the kicking position in the years prior before finding Zuerlein. So I love this deal for both sides. I think it makes a lot of sense.
I agree. I think this is the right move for the Jets. You had a good special teams. Don't mess it up. Like keep on doing what was doing well for you. And, you know, if you want to look at it from the other side's perspective, like the Giants, you know, our special teams was terrible last year. And it's something that you don't want to take for granted, having a good special teams. I remember when the Giants did have a good special teams, that kind of fell off in recent years. The Jets, they have a good special teams. You have to retain that core and keep that intact because it really is a very important aspect of football.
Absolutely. And I've gotten a lot of questions asked about Thomas Morstead and if I think the Jets will keep him. I do. He can't sign with the Jets until Wednesday, though, because there's some clause I was reading about that, didn't allow him to sign until the first day. So like he couldn't get one of those early deals done. So I would fully expect it. Moral of the story, I fully expect him to come back as well. As you mentioned, they were 3rd in special teams DVOA last year. Like, bring as much of that core back as you can. Brant Boyer has been a really good special teams coach over the last few years with this team, survived multiple regime changes for good reason. And, you know, there's a good start. Again, it's not like kicker's not sexy, but when you're a competitive team, or at least supposed to this year be more competitive, special teams matters a ton. And, you know, locking down a kicker at a fair value price for both sides is definitely a good start. I'll sign myself up for that.
Yeah, and I think it's important. And even Aaron Rodgers, didn't we discuss, I think, in the last episode where he went on a podcast recently and mentioned that he wants those guys to get extended. So he can recognize the value of it. I'm sure Jets fans can as well. I think it's really important to have a good special teams.
Absolutely. So where are you with the Giants right now on either, you know, retaining some of the bigger guys that hit free agents that are expected to hit free agency? I think we both kind of expect Saquon Barkley to walk here, but Xavier McKin, I think, feels like the big one that is, you know, debated a lot online. I know you're a big fan of trying to keep McKinney, but what do you think the chances of him staying are?
It feels kind of slim at this point. I would say it's slim to none with Saquon. I think there's zero chances. I won't say zero, but I think within the next hour and a half, we're probably going to hear Saquon Barkley's a Houston Texan or a Philadelphia Eagle. It sounds like his market is robust, and I think he's kind of done negotiating with the Giants. Obviously, last offseason, it didn't go as planned. He got hit with the franchise tag. That pissed him off. Then they keep him on the franchise tag with kind of this promise that they're going to extend him next offseason. They didn't extend him. They didn't even negotiate with him. So it just looks like they're probably going to check in once he gets some of those contract offers at the start of free agency, say, hey, what's the price tag? And they probably have a dollar amount that they're not going to exceed. So whatever the amount is that Saquon's going to get, either they match it or they just say, okay, thank you for your services and good luck elsewhere. And I think that's where it's headed because the more reports that I'm reading, the more that I'm seeing from different insiders, sounds like he's going to land a deal north of $10 million per season. Sounds like the Giants don't believe in paying a running back more than $10 million per season. So if he were to somehow have his market fall apart and get a deal underneath $10 million, maybe the Giants get involved. But realistically, I do think Saquon Barkley is walking in free agency. Now, Xavier McKin is the big question mark because sounds like the Giants are still negotiating with him and are still interested. They're still trying to retain him, but they do, as well as what they have with Saquon Barkley, they have a price blocker for Xavier McKinney, like a certain number that they won't go over. And it sounds like McKinney is going to exceed that number. So I think that McKinney is also gone, which truthfully pisses me off pretty badly. I think this is a situation that the Giants have fumbled in a terrible way. I think that his price tag is going to far exceed the $13.8 million that was on the transition tag. So the Giants really could have had an opportunity to at least negotiate with him in that respect. And hold some sort of leverage. But McKinney's probably going to get a deal north of $15 million per season. I'd be willing to pay it. Some Giants fans would be. Some Giants fans wouldn't be willing to. It's going to be a controversial situation for sure. But sounds like the Giants are still negotiating with him, and they might try to match offers at the right price. But it also does sound like his price tag might be going out of reach.
Yeah, that's one that I know we've been on for a while in the early stages of this new show, talking about Xavier McKinney a bunch, but it's a guy who's still in his prime, entering his prime right now in his mid-20s, is going to get a nice payday for the safeties. But if you look at the safety market, there's a lot of names out there, and some of the guys are a little bit on the older side in their later 20s or even some in their early 30s who, were released a little bit later. But this is one for the Giants where I don't know if you're going to be able to find an upgrade in free agency somewhere else. Like I'm a big proponent of finding and developing your own talent, but the next step is then you got to pay those guys. And I don't think it'd be an astronomical cost. It'd be a different conversation if, he came into the league as a 24-year-old rookie and is now 28 years old and looking for big money. But that's not the reality here. He's 24 years old right now, looking for his second contract. Those are the guys that you pay. I think letting him walk would be a mistake.
I feel the same way. I mean, if you go onto Spot Rack and you search free agents in the 2024 class, go to safeties, then sort by age, he's the fourth youngest player out of all free agent safeties in the NFL on Spot Rack. He's the fourth youngest player available. He's among all the youngest defensive backs in the league, youngest free agents in the league. McKinney's so young. And so, like you mentioned, he's in his prime, or he's entering his prime. I would even argue maybe he's not even in his prime just yet because he's only 24. He's this good now. How good can he be in 2 years once he's 26, when most safeties are entering their prime? So he's ahead of schedule. He's very good. And I get that there's this argument that Giants fans have of you need to build through the draft. You need to only pay the positions of value. Safety's a devalued position. Okay, so I hear that. But if you're talking about building through the draft, that doesn't mean you just get a bunch of rookies on rookie contracts running all over the place that don't know how to play football yet. It means taking those draft picks that you hit on, extending them, and keeping that homegrown talent. That would be extending Xavier McKinney at the fair market value. So I'm a huge proponent of signing him. I really hope that it happens. I hope that while we're recording this, I can react to it, and within the hour, they get a deal done. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that's going to be the reality. It really does sound like he's going to have a pretty strong market and end up signing elsewhere, which is super disappointing to me. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope that he and the Giants could come to terms on something, because I think when you look at this defense, he was so important to the success of it. When you look at the locker room, he's a huge leader. Everything that you want out of a player, especially a 24-year-old player, Xavier McKinney provides it to you. So I really think that he should be the priority move here.
No, I'm with you on that. And you bring up the logic of going through the draft, and in theory, yes. And that's something that we've seen a lot on Jets Twitter right now as well, trying to defend, not defend, but I guess maybe preemptively get in the mindset of if the Jets don't really spend in free agency and have a quiet free agency, that it's okay because you have to build through the draft. And while it's true, I do think you have to get your core and develop your core through the draft. Free agency is a really useful tool to help supplement your roster. And it's all about spending correctly. Again, from the Jets perspective on this, the last time the Jets were any good, 2009, 2010, they go on deep playoff runs. The precursor to that was they had a really strong 2008 free agency class. They were aggressive, brought in a lot of key veterans on the offensive line and some vets on the defensive side of the ball. And they had 3 straight winning seasons. So it's all about who you pay, right? you can't. I'm not saying spend like a drunken sailor and spend at the top of the market and reset, the market at positions that aren't necessarily super valuable to you. But I just hate the mindset that like teams should avoid free agency at all costs. I don't think that's true. I think the good teams find ways to supplement their young core that they are able to draft and develop through free agency and trades.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And like I said, the main point to building through the draft is finding the homegrown talent that's worth extending, hitting on those draft picks and then paying them and fortifying those positions, knowing that you drafted someone that you got, like this is your guy, you know how he fits into your culture, and now you're going to make him a long-term piece. That's the whole point of building through the draft. Xavier Mckin is an example of building through the draft. So I've seen fans argue that building through the draft would be letting him walk. I don't see it that way. I think, when you look back on when the Dallas Cowboys were building through the draft with that offensive line, and they took all those offensive linemen, they drafted them, and then they also extended them. And they've had a great offensive line for, how many years now? It's been like 10 years of great offensive line play from the Dallas Cowboys. You didn't get that if they let all those free agents walk, if they didn't extend those guys. So that's one argument. And I know you can debate the positional value of guard versus safety, and, you can have that conversation, but just generally speaking, the way that you build through the draft is to get these young guys and then extend them as building blocks. So McKinney, you guys know where I stand. You know how I feel about it. I think it's going to be a big mistake if the Giants let him walk. And the last thing I'll say on it is I know that there was a similar situation, 17, whatever it was, when Landon Collins walked in free agency. He got paid a boatload. He didn't pan out with Washington. The argument that I make is, first of all, McKinney is several years younger than Landon Collins, is a much better player right now and more versatile player than Landon Collins was when he was on the Giants. Plus, he went over to Washington, a very bad Washington team. Who's to say that if Landon Collins stuck with the Giants, had the same defensive coordinator and system, that he wouldn't have maintained his status and continued to be a good player? It's totally possible. I think a lot of times when these players switch teams, it hurts them like pretty badly and they become lesser good players elsewhere. I think that McKinney right here in this system and in this environment will continue to thrive, and that's why the Giants need to extend them.
No, absolutely. And I think you can make a similar comparison right now with the Jets and Bryce Huff as a guy that they found as an undrafted free agent in 2020, had to fight for his role on the team and has been someone who's gotten better year over year and is now finally set to hit the market. And he is, I would say it would be surprising at this point if he's back with the Jets, which just completely rubs me the wrong way. I think they completely mishandled this from almost the jump. Like he was someone who or I guess 2 years ago now, in 2022 was playing 20% of the snaps and was still like an efficient third down, specialist in obvious passing situations and was really good. And at that point, you had a section of Jet fans who were like, the Jets should extend this guy and give him a bigger role going forward. He's really efficient. He's proved that he's been efficient over the last few years. You found this homegrown, developed talent, pay him and you let it give him the bigger role. That was the argument to this year, because early on in the season, he wasn't really playing a lot. And the pushback that I was getting was, well, the only reason why he's so good is because of the limited snaps that he plays. As the year goes on, his snap counts goes up and essentially goes from 20% to 40%. And guess what? He was still productive. He had a double-digit sack season. It was extremely efficient for the Jets on not only third downs, but in multiple situations. They don't franchise, they don't transition tag him, and now they're in a spot where they're letting a homegrown, developed guy hit the free agent market at 25 years old because they were stubborn. They drafted Will McDonald last year and now just feel like, oh, he's going to be able to step in no problem to that role, which I think is a little bit naive. And in this system, they need at least 3 edge rushers with how much they rotate their guys and like to keep the line fresh. And just from not paying him a year ago plus to now letting him walk for nothing just seems like a complete mismanagement of assets. And when you see organizations and teams like the Philadelphia Eagles who, have some solid edge rushers that are looking to move on from some of their older guys so they could put an offer in on Bryce Huff, a team that drafted edge Nolan Smith in the first round last year, still in on Bryce Huff. Like, if that doesn't tell you all you need to know, then like, I don't know what spin zone you're going to be able to take on this one. I think it's a mistake no matter how you slice it.
I would agree with you. The only reason that I might disagree with you is because I feel like Bryce Huff is still kind of in a way an unproven talent, in the sense that you're right. Every time they've given him more to do, he's stepped up and he's performed and he's gotten better. Increased snap count means increased sack totals. That's all true. But we haven't seen his snap count increase to the 800 to 1,000 snaps range, right? I think his career high is still under 500 snaps in a season. And so that's why, for me as a Giants fan, knowing that Bryce Huff is going to be on the open market, the Giants are reportedly going to have some sort of interest, I still feel cautious about it. I'm still a little bit hesitant because this Giants defense and, what the Giants need, Kayvon Thibodeau played, I think, 950 snaps last year. They need an edge rusher who can match that production and match that total of snap count from Kayvon Thibodeau, somebody who's on the field with him the entire season. I don't know if Bryce Huff is fully capable of doing that just yet. Now, it looks like it because every time he's had more to do, he's done better, but still, we haven't seen him do it just yet. We haven't quite seen him on the field for that snap count, which is why I actually think he was a perfect franchise tag candidate or transition tag candidate, something along those lines. I think it would have made a lot of sense for the Jets to try and lock him in for something on a 1-year prove-it deal. Didn't work out. He's going to be an open free agent market, or player. So we'll see what happens there. I think the Jets probably should try to extend him because he is a homegrown talent, but that's also in the same respect or in the same vein of that Landon Collins argument I made. Who's to say that Bryce Huff switches teams and keeps on doing what he's been doing? Who's to say that he could continue to develop and be such a good player elsewhere? I'm not so sure as a Giants fan, my perspective, if I want to take this risk on what I still think is a somewhat unproven talent. He's proven that he's got talent and he's got potential and he does a lot of things really well, but he's also doing them in a good Jets defense with good coaches. He comes over to the Giants. Will he maintain that? Will he do better with the doubled snap count? I don't know. So I think there are a lot of question marks and red flags to raise on Bryce Huff. And maybe if you look at it from that perspective as a Jets fan, let somebody else pay him and find out if those red flags are more serious than what you currently realize.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to look at it from like a team who would be taking him on's perspective, right? Because you don't know if that is going to transition to the new spot. I think just from watching him, I think it's a risk that I would take in some comparisons that you bring up. Like Hassan Reddick, I think, is someone who really didn't really have a solid established role, and then he eventually makes his way to Carolina, has a good year, and then goes to Philly and is really pops off in his later 20s. Shaq Barrett is someone who was very similar and kind of more rotational role, gets a bigger role with Tampa Bay and ends up, having really, successful seasons there in Tampa as they go on and win a championship. Like I see a similar trajectory for Huff. And I know that's lofty expectations, right? Like both those guys are perennial double-digit sack, season guys, but I don't know. From, again, just putting it back on the Jets perspective of it, like losing your best edge rusher over stubbornness is just going to be a really hard pill for me to swallow, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's kind of how I feel about with the Giants and Xavier Mckin. I feel like this is stubborn, just pay the kid. He's 24. He's great. You got Bryce Huff. He's 25. He's great. And again, the argument of they fit in your system, they fit in your culture, and you know that they're going to continue to succeed here if you extend them. I don't know if McKinney's going to be successful if he goes to another team. I don't know if Bryce Huff is going to be successful if he goes to another team. I know that these players are successful with their current teams. Keeping them here is the best way to keep their talent high and keep your team on a good status. So, if I think the ideal scenario for both of those two players is to wind up back where they currently are. But if they do go elsewhere and they get all that money, that's great for them. They're going to get paid for sure. I think Bryce Huff, especially, I think his contract is going to surprise some people. I've seen some fans maybe think he's in that 15 range. I think he's going to push pretty close to that 20, which is kind of crazy in some respects, but also you might argue that it's worth it because of the upside that you're getting of a player at that age and of that value. So it'll be interesting to see how it shapes out with these two guys. But I like that you drew in the comparison between McKinney and Huff because there are similar situations for the Jets and Giants.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get into the second half of the show here, when we get into external links, I just wanted to talk about another guy the Jets brought back in Chuck Clark at safety. So the Jets traded for him last year. They gave up a 7th-round pick to the Baltimore Ravens, and he unfortunately tore his ACL in OTA, so he missed the entire season. And that was someone that I was really looking forward to watch with the Jets last year. And going into this season, I think he would be an upgrade for them at strong safety over what they had last year in Jordan Whitehead. For me, Whitehead is good at, getting those interceptions in big spots, and there's value in having those guys. But what kind of frustrates me with him is his missed tackles. He is perennial 15% missed tackle rate plus every single year, where Chuck Clark might not be as much of that ball hawk going to get the interceptions, but he's a little bit more steady and a more sure tackler. So I think this was actually going to be a move that is one going to be cheaper than retaining Jordan Whitehead, who's a free agent, but also I think could potentially be an upgrade for them on the back end as well.
Definitely. And I think that with the Jets, any of your free agent defenders, which could also apply to Bryce Huff, I mean, you had a great defense. You know that they fit the system. You know what Robert Saleh is trying to do defensively. Those are the players you want to retain. On the offensive side of the ball, maybe you can have some question marks and debate who to keep and who to let walk. But defensively, you've got some really good players there. You know that unit was working well altogether. So I think those are the players that you definitely want to prioritize retaining this offseason.
Absolutely. Anything else, Giants perspective? I saw, hang on, let's do this. Give me a second. We'll do a little live look in, Anthony Rivardo live look at sick to his stomach with Xavier McKinney looking at the Eagles and the Packers here.
If he goes to the Packers, okay. If he goes to the Eagles, I'm going to be unbearable. Don't speak to me. Like, don't be around me. I'm going to be sick because, and honestly, here's the point that I want to make is if the Eagles are that interested and the Giants know this, that should motivate the Giants even more to get a deal done with Xavier McKinney.
Right.
Don't let your player go within the division. Like, if that's what it comes down to is like, he's about to sign that deal with the Eagles, say, okay, whatever, screw it. I'm just going to go ahead and pay you because I don't want you to end up with Philadelphia. It should be a motivator for the New York Giants, but I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I'm scared.
Yeah, I don't blame you. And I know they're in division, probably don't like to give them a lot of props, but Eagles have done a lot of correct things building out their roster over the last few years. So like for McKinney being linked there and Huff being linked there, like I think that should tell you something as a Jets and a Giants fan. So they're going to be a team to keep an eye on. I think they'll be active today. Let's get into now. We'll do some external free agent targets. So we'll start. We did a lot of Jets in that last segment. So let's go some Giants talk. Who are you expecting them to be in on today?
So I don't know if I'm fully expecting them to be in on this one player, but I did read a report and I thought it was worth mentioning. Dan Duggan of The Athletic said that Brian Burns, pass rusher for the Carolina Panthers, is a player that could get traded. And the Giants would probably have a little bit of interest because Joe Shane apparently has a very good relationship with the Panthers general manager. So if there were to be a team that calls about Brian Burns, checks on the price, or if there were to be a team that gets called about Brian Burns and has a price checked on them, I think that it would be the New York Giants because of that relationship. So that could be interesting. The price tag, though, would be steep. I think he was offered from the Rams 2 firsts and a second at the deadline. The price tag isn't quite there, but you know what? It's probably still at least a second round pick, maybe 2, maybe even more than that, plus the contract, which Brian Burns, I keep saying Brian Burns is looking for about $30 million per season is the report. Probably lands somewhere in the 25 to 30 range, but even still, that's a lot of money to cough up for a player, not a homegrown talent, player that you don't know. I mean, tremendous player, really good talent, young talent, 25 years old, but this seems like a little bit too risky for me, a little bit too steep of an asking price, but I guess it's something that Giants fans should be monitoring.
Yeah, I don't know if that's something they end up pulling the trigger on because of just some other available names of free agency where you wouldn't have to give up assets in a trade and then sign him. Like that, there's no denying that he's a great player, but could you just pivot and sign Danielle Hunter or Bryce Huff at that point and get similar value? I think you can make an argument that they absolutely could, but I mean, he's a stud, so you're going to have to keep a close eye on him, but I don't know if that would be my preferred route if I'm a Giants fan.
Yeah, it's something that I'm against personally. I think that it's a pretty solid market of edge rushers in this free agency class. I like that you mentioned Danielle Hunter. I think he's going to be about the same price tag as Brian Burns, and I understand there's a big age difference there, so that adjusts the value. But I'd rather pay the money for a Hunter and not give up the draft capital than pay the money for a Burns and give up the draft capital is kind of where I stand on it. But, outside of that, we could talk about one player that I think both the Jets and Giants should be interested in. Of course, I know that the Giants are interested, and I think they're going to make a solid run at Mike Onwenu from the New England Patriots. I think the Giants view him as more of a right guard than a right tackle. He's going to get right tackle money, so he's going to get paid probably around $20 million per season. But I think the Giants' intentions are to sign him and move him into right guard, where he's played really well at for the Patriots. He's played well at tackle as well. The versatility is super important. What are they going to do with Evan Neal? Who knows? But getting Onwenu gives them an option at right tackle if Evan Neal continues to stink. Gives them an option at guard if Evan Neal turns it around. So I think this is the number one player that the Giants are going to be trying to target, but I think that's how a lot of teams are feeling. They're going to go all in on Mike Onwenu. So easier said than done, but that's the number one name I'd keep an eye on if I was, a Giants fan.
Yeah, I would love for the Jets to be in on him. And something you mentioned that is really appealing to me is his flexibility, that he could play either guard or tackle. And from the Jets side of things, like, they have a decision to make with Elijah Vera Tucker where they want to play him. Joe Douglas said earlier in the offseason at the Combine, I believe, during his press conference, that they want to find the spot for Vera Tucker and then kind of just leave him there. The last 2 years, they bounced him around between guard and tackle. And while it's great that he can play both positions, eventually I totally get like just wanting to put him at a spot and stick. So those two guys, in whichever order you want to put them in, whether it's AVT at guard or Onwenu at guard and, vice versa at tackle, like that could be a really nice right side of the line for you. Which, I mean, hey, we know the Jets need 3 new starters on this offensive line. It's going to be dependent on what they see or how they see AVT and Joe Tippmann for them next year, because both guys play multiple positions. So I'm curious to see what route they go, whether they want to go the veteran center or go more guard heavy or tackle heavy or what. But Onwenu's someone who could fit multiple positions. So I love that for him with his flexibility.
Yeah, the flexibility, the versatility. I mean, having a player that can move across the line seamlessly, it's super important. And it's one of those things that you can't take for granted, because when injuries arise or a player starts struggling, having somebody that can move across the line and just kind of be that linchpin piece no matter where he plays, it's so important. And then one other offensive lineman I'll throw out there before, if you want to dive into a couple of Jets guys for the Giants, I'd say Robert Hunt would be their pivot. Miami Dolphins right guard. I'd say they're probably going to prioritize Onwenu because of that versatility to play both guard and tackle. If they strike out on him, I don't think that they're going to go after the next best tackle. They're going to go after the next best guard. The interior of the offensive line seems to be what the Giants really want to prioritize and upgrade. Robert Hunt, the best guard on the free agency market outside of Onwenu, arguably. Robert Hunt's a beast, elite run blocker, great pass protector, has been really good with the Miami Dolphins. Plus, he also does have that versatility. He came into the NFL as a right tackle. He transitioned into guard, but he can swing back out to tackle and play that at an average level as well. So you would be upgrading in the same respect of getting an elite guard and a possible tackle option if you do have injuries on the line. So Robert Hunt would be the next name I'd keep an eye on.
Yeah, I like him a lot as well. I'm curious to see where his market ends up, because we've seen a lot of interior players on the line get paid some pretty big money. And, with him being the next guy, I think he's going to be pretty costly. That's not to say that he's not, worth ponying up the money and pay for, but I do agree. I think I see the Giants in on Hunt a little bit more than the Jets. I would be surprised if they went that route and paid that kind of money at guard. I think they would probably go for more of like a John Runyon tier, one, because of the Aaron Rodgers familiarity, but two, because that's probably going to be like 6 to 8 million a year versus, 16 plus million a year.
Yeah, I think both of those players that are going to push really, really high because of how competitive that market is. So Hunt, it wouldn't shock me if he gets close to that 20 million, just like Onwenu as well. It's going to be a really competitive market for those offensive linemen.
Absolutely. For the Jets, I wanted to talk some wide receiver stuff. And M. Creighton in the chat chimes in, says, does Calvin Ridley, who will be turning 30 this year, give you any concern on possibly giving him a big lucrative wide receiver money? A little bit. Like, everyone always kind of forgets how old Calvin Ridley is. He came into the league as an older prospect. I do think he's probably the best free agent on the market, and he is going to get paid big money, probably $20+ million a year. I don't know if the Jets are going to be able to outbid everyone on that. That's kind of why I've talked a lot about the trade market, like Cortland Sutton, Deontay Johnson, and even now more recently, you can pull up T. Higgins as someone who's going to be looking for a trade. The T one, though, I think is slightly different because he's going to cost you. They're supposedly looking for a first round pick. I don't think the Jets could give up pick 10. Like, that's just asking way too much. And then he's going to sign a big money contract on top of that. So I don't see the Jets in on Ridley or Higgins, but I guess that's TBD. What's your take on both, I guess, Ridley and Higgins, and where you'd pivot if you were from the Jets perspective?
From the Jets perspective and even the Giants perspective, because there are some Giants fans who want the team to go after a playmaking weapon like a Ridley or a Higgins. What I'll say is that this is not the offseason, in my opinion, to invest big money into a wide receiver. This is the offseason to invest draft capital. So if you can go after a guy in the second or third round of the draft that you feel like has a really solid upside, especially for the Jets don't need a wide receiver one. Like T. Higgins is your primary guy in most offenses. They don't need that. They need a really solid number two. They've got Garrett Wilson. That's your number one. Get a complementary piece to Garrett Wilson. You don't have to swing for the fences with a guy like Calvin Ridley, who for some teams is going to be a WR1. For other teams, he'll be a WR2. But for the Jets, I mean, you've got your primary receiving threat. You need a complementary piece. Paying big money to either of those two guys, I mean, you're talking steep price tags, $20+ million per season for those guys. And again, when you're pulling players from different teams, putting them onto a new team, who knows how they perform? T. Higgins has had the luxury of playing alongside Jamar Chase throughout his career. That helps. That makes you a better player when you're playing along such a great player like that. Calvin Ridley, again, I think you brought up a really good point. Is he still going to be effective in 2 to 3 years from now? How old is he going to be playing? I think that's something that you do have to keep in mind, is that he is beginning to get up there in age. So for the Jets, I think that honestly what their priority should be is to shop that lower end market for the wide receivers in free agency, sign someone who's good enough to be a WR2, but not, anything too flashy. It's not too big of a splash. And then maybe if you can, trade around in the draft, move up into that second round. There's going to be solid wide receiver talent in the second round. It sucks that the Jets don't have a second round pick, but even because of that, I would say T. Higgins is not an option for them because he probably costs about a second round pick. So I think you could take T. Higgins off the board for the Jets unless something drastic changes and something really exciting happens. But realistically, with how talented this wide receiver draft class is, that should be the focus for both the Jets and the Giants at improving that position. Spending big money at the position this offseason, it doesn't make a whole bunch of sense to me. Maybe you've got a different perspective or opinion, that's fine. But I just think that this is the offseason to really go in on the draft at the wide receiver spot.
No, I'm with you. And like you said, the Jets don't have their second because of the Rodgers trade last year. And, that's tough. But at pick 10, if they trade down and pick up a second round pick, like there's ways to go about getting more assets. They could also package some, they have multiple 4th round picks and a 3rd, so they could get their way into the second if they really wanted to for some of these names. If they begin to fall in the draft, I think the second is a sweet spot for wide receivers this year. But the reason why I have a guy like Tyler Boyd on the graphic here, that's a guy that they've been linked to in free agency. He was kind of the forgotten guy in Cincinnati for a little bit the last few years. Before Higgins and Jamar Chase got there, he was a big part of that offense. And even as the third option over the last 2 years or 3 years, however long it's been, I think he's still been a productive guy. And I don't think he's going to cost you crazy money. I think he probably gets $10 million or less. And I think he could come in and fill in the slot and be, productive for you in the intermediate game, which, like, let's be honest, outside of Garrett Wilson, the Jets could use some upgrades there. So while Boyd might not be the sexiest of names, I think he could come in and be pretty productive for you at the cost.
I like Boyd. I think that's a good idea there because rather than going for those big names like a Calvin Ridley, like a T. Higgins, Boyd is one of those players where I feel like you can get him on a cost-controlled contract, not anything too expensive, and you can get a really solid player out of it. Somebody who is dependable, reliable, and can give you consistency and solid production at the wide receiver spot. So that would be the name that I would target if I were the Jets, on that secondary tier of free agents at the wide receiver spot, not necessarily making those big splash signings. But Boyd, really, I think that's probably the best one that you're going to pinpoint for the Jets options at the wide receiver spot.
No, absolutely. There was an interesting thing I saw on Twitter just a second ago on the Giants side of things. I want to pull up the tweet from Conor Hughes, who covers both the Jets and the Giants. Pulls this: if the Giants were to lose Saquon Barkley, the Eagles or Texans, both of whom were involved, at $10 million APY, they will pivot name to watch Tony Pollard. Now, I feel like that's a name that we maybe haven't heard as much linked to the Giants. What would your take be on adding a guy like Tony Pollard after letting Saquon walk?
Honestly, this one confuses me. It's one that I saw Jeremy Fowler of ESPN mention a couple days ago, talked about it on Fireside Giants, and kind of said that it's not a deal that I'm interested in. I feel like that's probably too expensive. I mean, sure, the Giants don't want to go 10 plus million per year with Saquon. I don't know what Tony Pollard's market's going to be, but I have to feel like it's not that far away from the 10 plus million per year. It's probably 8, I would say. And even then, I think if you're the Giants, if you're going to commit to this mantra of not paying running backs, don't pay running backs. Don't bring in an outside talent from within the division and pay him 8. Go after one of those lower cost guys like a Devin Singletary or a Zach Moss, one of those $4 to $5 million guys. Save the money. Like, just fully commit to it. If you're committed to not paying a running back a high price, fully commit to it. Don't go out there and sign a free agent to an expensive deal. And Tony Pollard feels like he would be higher than the price range that I would be willing to go if I were the Giants.
Yeah, I agree with. I feel like he's going to be in that same tier, like Derrick Henry and Josh Jacobs. Like, toss those two guys in the Pollard and Saquon tier at the top of the market, who are going to get paid. And supposedly, like, teams are willing to move on both those guys, pretty quick here. I was seeing that, there's not an expectation that they're going to hang around, that they're going to be gone relatively quickly into the tampering period. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Giants pivot. And I do believe that they're going to have to pivot. I don't think Saquon's back, but I'm with you. A name we both talked about already on this show in past episodes, but DeAndre Swift, I think, would be a really nice ad for the Giants, who doesn't have as much miles on him and is probably a tier above some of those names you listed off, like a Singletary or Moss.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that when you can get 1,000-yard rusher in DeAndre Swift for such a low cost, because I think he's really not going to cost you too much. That's the move that I would make. Like, if the Giants really don't want to spend that 10 plus million on a running back, which is totally understandable, pivot towards a guy that's still young, doesn't have a ton of mileage, but proven. He's proven that he can be a workhorse back and go for 1,000 yards. So I like the idea of Swift. I also do like the idea of Moss. I think that there's more to be unlocked with Zach Moss. If he was given that lead role, I think that he could do more with it. When he had the lead role in Indianapolis, I believe he was averaging 95-ish rushing yards per game before Jonathan Taylor came back to the lineup. So you'd have to assume that if he could have done that for the first, I think it was 5 weeks of the season with Indianapolis, if you were to give him the keys to the backfield and make him your lead rusher, if he can replicate production close to that, I mean, you're getting a very solid, hopefully 1,000-yard rusher out of him. So Zach Moss, and I think that he'd be even cheaper than DeAndre Swift. Plus, last thing to mention, Zach Moss, I believe he was in Buffalo for some time, so he does have a familiarity with both Brian Daboll and Joe Shane, the general manager. So there is a connection there. If the Giants are interested in him, I think that he makes a lot of sense.
No, absolutely. And both names you mentioned, by the way, with Moss and Singletary, both former Bills, so have the connection to the Giants, but also the Jets are probably going to be in an RB2 this year through free agency. They have Izzy Abanikanda, who they drafted last year, and obviously Bryce Hall, but I think they're going to be interested in adding a back. And both those two names you mentioned, Zach Moss and Singletary, are two guys that I would be looking at in that, maybe $4 million range. And if you get one of them as an RB2, I think that would be awesome to complement Bryce Hall. But that's the tough thing too. Like, some of these guys are going to want to go to areas where maybe they could be an RB1 and be more the workhorse back. But I'm hoping that, maybe some of the bigger names go and the Jets are able to grab, some of the guys we just listed off in that $4 or $5 million range to help spell Bryce Hall.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I'll even say, though, to that point, with some of these more expensive players, it's been weird that the Giants have been linked to a couple of those guys. I mean, we just mentioned, obviously, Tony Pollard. I also saw earlier this week that the Giants are reportedly having some sort of interest in Josh Jacobs. I don't get it. At that point, just pay Saquon. Pay the guy that you know and has been in your locker room and is a great leader. If the Giants are going to go cheap at running back, you got to go way cheaper than a Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard, in my opinion. Those guys are still going to cost you a pretty sizable amount at that running back spot. But I would like a guy like a Zach Moss, and then, in the 4th, 5th round, whatever, draft a running back, supplement it through that. And for what it's worth, the Giants did do that last year. They did bring in Eric Gray. They just didn't give him an opportunity to play. It was very strange. It's one of the things I've been most critical about with this coaching staff is their hesitance to put Eric Gray on the field. I'm not sure what it was all about, but maybe he takes a step forward this next season. It's totally possible. But I think you do have to actually bring in some sort of veteran talent as well.
No, I'm with you. That makes a ton of sense. And then there's no reason they can't add another back in the mid rounds. I love the value of running backs between like the second and fifth. You could go even later, but rounds 2 to 5, you could find talent very, very easily, in my opinion, at the running back spot. As we're wrapping here, any like just gut feeling predictions, what to expect out of the Giants today, whether it's guys leaving, guys who are going to end up signing? Supposedly they're going to make a big run on Wainu, as someone we mentioned already today. We'll see if they sign him, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, my prediction for the Giants is they are going to make one big splash signing at guard, whether that's on Wainu or Hunt. I think they're going to land one of the two players. If they don't, they're going to find somebody, maybe Jonah Jackson on that second tier. They're going to make a splash on the offensive line. I think you can almost lock that in. The Giants are very committed to improving this offensive line. They know how big of a need it is, and they've been doing their homework and research based on everything that we've been reading and hearing. So I do think they're going to make one big splash on offensive line, and then I think you can bet on them, maybe not today, but within the next couple of days, locking in a solid veteran at CB2. That's a really sneaky need for this team. It doesn't get talked about enough, but Adoree Jackson's leaving in free agency. Deontay Banks is, of course, your primary cornerback. Opposite him, you're not going to rely on 6th-round pick from last year, Trey Hawkins, to give you 17 games. You got to bring in a veteran. So I do think that the Giants are going to make some sort of a solid move there to bring in a secondary cornerback. Again, not a splash move. I'm not talking about shopping the top of the market or trading for L'Jarius Sneed or anything, but some of those other lower priced guys. Sean Murphy Bunting is a name that I would keep an eye on in that range. I think that's a move that the Giants are going to make.
All right. I think, well, first, Bryce Huff's going to leave. I'm going to cry. I'm going to be very upset about that. And then Jets go to like middle tier guys, like a Boyd and Runyon, two guys he mentioned on this group. Jet fans are going to be upset when they see some of the bigger names on the market go. But I think Boyd's a name that I've really liked at wide receiver. Runyon's not my favorite guard option, but I could just see it with the Aaron Rodgers connection. So we'll do mid-tier guard and mid-tier wide receiver on day one, and hopefully some more aggressive plays after that.
Yeah, there you go. And I think the same way that you're going to be upset when Bryce Huff leaves, I think it's going to be a really painful day for me. And not with Saquon Barkley. I'm prepared for him to leave. That's okay. But Xavier McKinney, especially if he goes to Philadelphia, it's going to be ugly. I'm going to tear this regime to shreds on social media if they let Xavier McKinney leave within the division.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited for Thursday. Just back in a few days, we'll react to some of the moves that have happened so far. Hopefully on the positive side, but if we need to rip the Jets and the Giants, we're more than willing to do that. Anthony, where can people follow along with you and find your Giants takes?
Follow me on Twitter at Anthony_Rivardo. Check me out on Fireside Giants for all my Giants coverage. And for any of my general NFL and NFL draft coverage, I got a personal channel. Just search up Anthony Rivardo on YouTube and you'll find me there. So pretty much covering it all. And yeah, those are places you can find me.
Absolutely. I'm at Matt O'Leary NY on YouTube, social media. Talking Jets will be streaming tomorrow night on Tuesday, recapping day 1 and day 2 of the tampering period. But that's going to do it for us on this episode. We'll be back on Thursday with some more free agency talk. Matt, he's Anthony. We'll catch you next time.